welcome everybody to this month's Thursday. I am Erica. I'm the secretary on the board here, and I'm the Dorset librarian, and I'm also filling in it for John because he's away today. He usually does a really good introduction, so I'm not the best speaker here. But we have Bradley Bender from the Mt Tabor-Danby Historical Society, and he's going to be talking about Vermont's first millionaire, Silas Lapham Griffith, and Ann Rothman, who did research and wrote a book. So welcome Bradley.
Thank you. So before I begin, I'll have a little show and tell, show you some pictures that when I'm speaking you can put faces and places with names. So this is Annie Rothman. Her maiden name was Carfiol, and her father invented the dye machine that made paper doilies possible. So she was known as the paper doily princess. And, she's quite a wealthy woman. In the 1960s, she and her second husband bought a house in Danby, and you'll hear more about that as we go.
Could you speak up a little louder?
Sure, we'll do that. Now, on the blurb about today's event, it mentioned that Silas Griffith was related to a world-famous Dorset resident. Does anybody know who that was? I'll give you a clue. The gentleman's grandfather's last name was Griffith. Gardner Fayette Griffith. So Gardner Fayette Griffith was the father of William Griffith Wilson, Bill Wilson. So Silas and Bill Wilson were first cousins once removed. And Silas made his big money in lumber and charcoal. And in the Chicago World's Fair back in, I think it was 1892, he had on display a piece of charcoal that was about as wide as this room. They actually turned a very large log into a piece of charcoal. And we had a picture of that in our Historical Society, but as many of you probably recall, back when Hurricane or Tropical Storm Irene came through, we lost our building and we lost a lot of great things, including that picture. But since then, someone came forth with this certificate showing that he was one of the people that participated in the Chicago World's Fair. He was twice married. His first wife was a very attractive woman, a Danby native, Elizabeth Staples, and they divorced. She divorced him on the grounds of intolerable severity, which means he cheated on her. And he wanted to run for Vermont State Senate, but back in the 1890s, if you were a divorced person, man, women didn't even have the right to vote then, you weren't looked upon too favorably. So he cooked something up with a distant relative in Pennsylvania, Charles Mason Griffith, who had a relative, Kate Teal, and it was kind of an arranged marriage. And this is a picture of his second wife, Kate. And she lived until 1938. This is a picture shortly before she passed away in her driveway there in Danby. And Silas only had one child who lived to maturity. His last child was a little boy named Harry, who he was just delighted when Harry came along because now he had a male heir for his empire. But Harry passed away at the age of 5, basically from dysentery. So if something like Pepto-Bismol had been invented at that time, he may have lived. So that was pretty sad. And Silas left trust funds for various things that I'll talk a little more about later, but one of them that goes on to this very day is the Silas Griffith Christmas tree. So every child in Danby and Mount Tabor is invited to a Christmas tree party at the Danby Congregational Church the 3rd Tuesday of December, and they are given a gift and a bag of candy, which was a Victorian tradition, and also an orange, which was very, very rare in Victorian times. So that tradition carries on today, and there's a New York Times article that talks about that. In case anybody doesn't know what a charcoal kiln looks like, this is one of his many charcoal kilns. Silas owned 50,000 acres of what's now the Green Mountain National Forest, essentially all the way from Wallingford to Stratton and Arlington. And he had 13 different mill villages, and most of those mill villages had a collection of charcoal kilns, 4 to 10. So nothing went to waste. Any lumber that was not big enough for dimensional kind of lumber, clapboards, etc., went into the charcoal kilns. And that's how he really made his big money. He had a contract with a company that manufactured steel down in Lime Rock, Connecticut, and charcoal was the ingredient that fired the steel furnaces, and he shipped it out by rail and made what would be about $1 billion a year in today's money back in the 1890s. He built a series of roads up the mountain, and back in those days, steam shovels and bulldozers hadn't been invented. It was all shovels and pick and axe. This is a picture of building the road up to Griffith Lake, which is now known as the Lake Trail. If any of you have hiked that, you go in from what we call the south end in Mount Tabor, and there's still evidence of the trestle. You can look down and see the footings. There was a big trestle that went across a rock face. It must have been a very beautiful road, but when the National Forest Service took over, they burned the trestle. Now they hire archaeologists to come and do excavations and see where things were. So this is one of the pictures of his house that he built in 1891 for his new bride. And it was operated for a number of years, up until about 10 years ago, as a bed and breakfast / restaurant known as the Silas Griffith Inn. It's currently being restored as a private residence. This is another picture looking from the road up at the house, and you can also see the greenhouses. Silas was very big on flowers. He won competitions at the flower show up in Burlington, and he competed against Dr. Webb. The Webb family started Shelburne Museum. This is a picture of his office, which was down by the railroad tracks, and some of you might remember the Danby train station that was there that came down about 10 years ago. But this was on the eastern side of the tracks. The railroad station was just on the west side of the tracks. Very beautiful building. It had rare woods inside, like mahogany. Just gorgeous. Typical rich man's office. And then up on top of the mountain, bordering on Peru, there was Buffum Pond, which is now called Griffith Lake or Lake Griffith, and he built a 20-room lodge up there. It was a summer place, didn't have year-round heat in it, and he would entertain various dignitaries up there. He stocked the lake with trout, so the people that came to visit always were able to catch tons of fish. And on this picture, it shows the other side of the lake. He cleared back from the shore of the lake some distance and planted azaleas. So in June, if anybody ever hikes up there, you'll still see some of these beautiful pink azaleas that are in bloom. And he had benches and so forth. It was quite a beautiful retreat. So that's my show and tell. And the book that Ann Rothman wrote, we were finally able to publish through the generosity of the two gentlemen that bought Annie's properties after she passed away. And they thought it would be a nice tribute to her to get the manuscript published, which finally took place. This book is available through Amazon or on the Mt Tabor-Danby Historical website. So, as Erica told you, I'm Bradley Bender, president of the Mt Tabor-Danby Historical Society. In the mid-1980s, my first wife and I owned and operated the Silas Griffith Inn on South Main Street in Danby, the site of the estate that Silas built as a wedding present for his second wife. This time frame coincided with Ann Carfield Rothman's purchase of a number of properties in the center of the village, which included the Griffith store, built in 1861. Annie and her second husband had purchased an old farm on Danby Hill Road in the 1960s to be used as a ski house and a second home. When her second marriage ended, Annie engaged in an affair with a Danby native who sparked her interest in Silas Griffith as he told her countless tales and she recorded this oral history. Annie commenced writing a biography of Silas and interviewed many of Danby's old-timers. She was convinced that her narrative would become a bestseller and made it into a movie. So she purchased the buildings in the center of town, thinking that they would be an essential part of the film. Perhaps she got this idea because the movie Baby Boom had just been filmed, and there were a number of sequences that were shot in Danby at that time. A lot of it was shot over in Peru also. Annie met with numerous rejections from publishers since Gilded Age biographies were not considered bestsellers. The stress of renovating the Griffith Mansion, building an innkeeping business, and a new baby led to a divorce between Jocelyn and me, and provided more time for me to develop a friendship with Annie, which largely centered around Danby history and Silas. Annie provided the funding to start the Mt Tabor-Danby Historical Society, and I was a charter member. On June 27th, 1837, Silas Lapham Griffith was born in Danby to a family that already had lived there for 2 generations. He loved Danby, he loved fish and fishing, he loved flowers, and he loved making money, and he became Vermont's first millionaire. He loved the Congregational Church across the street from the mansion, and he especially loved children, perhaps because 3 of his own passed at a very young age. He was raised on his father's farm with his sister and brothers, but he always was very close to his dad's sister and her husband, Jessie Lapham, who owned Maple Terrace, which was the original house on the hill that was torn down to build the one that I just showed you pictures of. Jessie Lapham had 2 stores. He had one in Danby and he had one in South Wallingford. There's a building on the corner of Hartsboro Road that's kind of now falling to pieces, but about 10 years ago or so they took a lot of the siding off, and you can see painted on the side of the building an advertisement for boots and so forth. I hope that the building doesn't completely disappear, but it's not looking good for it. And Jessie Lapham also was one of the founders of the Danby Bank. The house had the same design as the house we call the 1820 House of Antiques on South Main Street, just south of the library. His Uncle Jesse built the stone store, which is now the Masonic Lodge, and Silas preferred helping out in the store to working on the farm. He did well in math at school and went to Kimball Union Academy in Meriden, New Hampshire. He graduated with high honors and came home to Vermont to work in the Union store in East Dorset, which is now the residence across from the Wilson House, and you have a very fine picture of that back there. He did that for about a year and a half. Then in 1858, he opened his own store on the corner of Main Street and Brook Road in the Green Building by the bridge in Danby. He also served as Danby postmaster, and he had the post office in his store. In those days, if you had a general store, there was always a big competition to be postmaster, and that was apparently assigned on a yearly basis. And the thinking behind that was people came to collect their mail, and when they collected their mail, they also said, oh, you know, I need potatoes or coffee or whatever. In 1861, he built the large 5,000 square foot, 3-story store with the long front porch that still stands today. There are 2 businesses there. There's Mountain Weaver and Indigo Green. It's at the intersection of Mount Tabor Avenue as you come in from Route 7. You drive straight toward it. It was the tallest building in southern Vermont until 1916, when a 5-story skyscraper was built in Rutland. It was a true department store, selling everything from food to clothing to furniture, carpets, hardware, cleaning supplies, and farm items and lumber. He was a successful young man, and in 1863, at the age of 26, he married the love of his life, 19-year-old Elizabeth Staples. The couple's first child, Lottie, was born the following year. She lived only a month and a half. Silas's store thrived, and in 1864, he sold $48,000 worth of goods. a lot of money in those days. He also sold the business, but not the property, to his brothers and devoted all of his time to the lumber business. His daughter Jenny came along in 1865. She was not conceived by Elizabeth, but was raised by Elizabeth as her own daughter. She was the only one of his 4 children to live to adulthood. In 1874, daughter Agatha was born, and she only lived 14 months. Then in 1878, Harry was born. Silas was very fond of his son and proud that he finally had a male heir to carry on his business. Unfortunately, Harry died shortly after his 5th birthday in April of 1883. Following the death of his aunt and uncle, Silas bought the 30-acre Maple Terrace across the street from the church on Main Street, which included an orchard and pasture land. He also purchased 12.5 acres up on Easy Street from the Grady family and built a spring house and installed a water system to supply the borough and his works by the depot. The water system is still the Town of Danby water system, and the spring puts out about 350 gallons a minute. It's a really wonderful source of water, contrary to what the state might say from time to time. The new home didn't bring him much happiness for too long, though, especially after the death of his son Harry, and his wife divorced him on the grounds of intolerable severity in 1886. Despite all of his wealth, Maple Terrace became a very lonely place for Silas after his wife and daughter left. He grew to hate the house on the hill, haunted with memories of his own childhood visits to his aunt and uncle and those of his dead son. In 1891, he married a very distant Philadelphia cousin, Catherine Teal, in the hope that his reputation as a married rather than divorced man would improve his standing with the voters as he planned to run for Vermont Senate. She was 18 years younger than Silas and flatly refused to live in the house which he occupied with his first wife. So, while Silas was courting KT in Philadelphia that summer, he gave orders to his men back in Danby to tear down the old Lapham place, and the house was dismantled and burned in Griffith's charcoal kilns over by the depot. A beautiful new Queen Anne-style Victorian house was built in its place, complete with greenhouses and an elaborate carriage house with servants' quarters and other outbuildings and barns. Beginning in 1893, he built a road up the mountain where he built a 20-room lodge known as the Lake House. It had a full-time chef, and it overlooked Griffith Lake. He also built a fish hatchery at the south end, which is part of Mt Tabor, along where Route 7 goes through, and you see the National Forest sign on the right-hand side. The Otter Creek is right there by the side of the road. Just back from there was the fish hatchery. That hatchery supplied trout, which were packed in ice and shipped by rail to the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. In 1898, he was elected senator on the Republican ticket. Then, after returning from a trip to the Holy Land, where he spent time in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, on Christmas Eve of 1901, Silas Griffith began the tradition of holding a grand party known as a Christmas tree in the church. He loved the church and not only built the addition to the back of the building, but attended regularly, always sitting in the second pew on the right, and supplied flowers from his greenhouses, especially lilies at Easter time. At the first party, there were 3 large spruce trees, each reaching nearly to the ceiling, and more than 500 gifts for the 140 children who attended. Silas was very clear when he created the trust fund that provides these gifts still today, as well as winter clothing, that the party was for all children, regardless of their religion or lack of religion, and even Jewish children in town received a gift, a bag of candy and an orange, which was not always easy to find in Vermont in those days. Silas Griffith died rather suddenly at his San Diego ranch, The Palms, on July 22nd, 1903. In 1990, I was operating my wall-covering installations academy in what many people popularly call the haunted house on Route 7. It's up there where the storage units are. A middle-aged woman from Virginia enrolled, and after several days of training said to me one day, "You enjoy history, and particularly that surrounding the local man, don't you?" Took me quite by surprise. I agreed. She proceeded to tell me that she was a psychic and offered to allow me to participate in a quick test to prove that she possessed extraordinary abilities. I was to ask her questions that had a yes or a no answer, and she answered each one of those correctly. And I mean, these were not things that were obvious questions that I asked her. So I believed. I mentioned this fascinating person to my friend Annie, and she invited us to dinner at her home one evening. The woman questioned Annie about her writing project and said, "You believe he was murdered, don't you?" Annie agreed, and the woman asked if she could be alone in a room with a picture of Silas for a short time. Annie agreed and showed her to a guest room. In a short time, Nina returned to the living room and asked Annie if she thought KT committed the act. Annie replied yes, and Nina told her that KT did not, but had arranged for it to happen. She claimed that the woman responsible for the murder had drugged Silas's dinner, causing him to retire early. Once he fell asleep, she inserted a long hat pin through his navel and caused damage to internal organs and bleeding, which resulted in his death in several days. Silas's last will and testament established a number of trusts, one of which built the S.L. Griffith Memorial Library on Main Street in Danby and endows it rather handsomely to this day, and another provided for the continuation of the Christmas tree party, and yet another provided funds for the continual care and maintenance of the Danby Cemetery up on Route 7. So this is a fascinating book. I've just scratched the surface with some of the things that are covered in here, but it's a wonderful look at the Gilded Age and what we call robber barons. Thank you. So I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes?
Where did most of the workers from the quarries live, and what kinds of?
Okay, well, Silas was not in the quarry business. He was in the lumber and charcoal. But the quarry workers lived mostly near the quarry in company-owned houses that Redfield Proctor built, and largely they were a duplex style, and many of those are still there today.
How did he get his name, the Santa Claus Bandit?
because of this business of the Christmas gifts, so he's the ongoing Santa
He
Claus.
did this anonymously? They didn't know who was
Oh,
providing?
no, they knew.
Yeah.
But he was also called a robber baron because part of the lumbering operation, and this was not unique to Silas, any of these big lumber jobs, when they got near the property line, they'd still keep going. And Silas was involved in 2 lawsuits from neighbors of property that he owned where he had cut on their land. And he lost both of the suits and resolved that in the future he would settle out of court rather than go through the whole process.
I knew Annie in the 80s. I think of her with a lot of sadness. She was a dreamer. She had the gift shop, and I used to find old windows and knock the glass out and clean them up and put mirrors in them.
Right.
And she would take them on consignment and sell them. So I had a lot of chances to talk with her. And the 2 things I remember about her was, one was that she really wanted to turn Danby into a center. She had the back of the stores that was going to be a big gathering place,
Right.
A park, and people would flock there. And it would be, I guess it of course never happened. But she had such wonderful dreams for Danby and loved Danby. And the second one, I guess her last years, I guess she was almost a prisoner in the 2nd floor of that building, ill, and the last time I saw her, I think she couldn't even come down the stairs. I had to go up the stairs to see her. It was a very sad ending, but she was a real character.
She was a real character, and she was raised in a life of privilege, and she could afford to do really whatever she wanted. And those last years, as you say, just passed quietly, and her health declined. She was basically a chain smoker. She smoked more cigarettes, and that upstairs room just smelled like an ashtray. And she smoked other things too, which eased some of the pain. But she was just a fascinating person, a lot of fun to be around. And we had a great relationship. I took care of a lot of the plantings on the property, and one day I was trimming back some of her PG hydrangeas, and she came out and she said, "Bradley, you are just like Jesus Christ with a pair of clippers in your hand." It's a lot of fine memories. She's interred up in Scottsville Cemetery. Silas is at one end of the cemetery, she's at the other. And on her tombstone it says, "The Duchess of Danby." Does anybody remember the Buttery restaurant down
Yes.
in the Jelly Mill? Pat, what was her last name, who ran that? I can't think of it, but she and Annie were very good friends. And Pat nicknamed her the Duchess of Danby.
The building, sort of, it was the land of broken dreams. The number of people who started restaurants there and dreamed, and it was their passion, and then they failed. And there's so many different stores that have been in there and out of there, but people still do it. I guess they still dream, and it's never.
Yeah, you know, the place really was very, very sad looking in the early 1960s. Then Pearl Buck came along and bought a number of the buildings, and she only lived for 3 years, and her estate just became a real mess to settle because Pearl had adopted, I believe, 9 children. She only had one natural child who suffered from PKU and spent her life at the New Jersey Training School in Vineland Jersey, and only matured to the mental capacity of a 5-year-old. But the other adopted children, even though that Pearl had established individual trust funds for them, were greedy, and they just turned that estate upside down and whatnot, and it took years to settle, but the children triumphed and got the proceeds from the literary rights.
You mentioned, could you maybe elaborate on how his first child was born to a woman, not his wife?
His second child.
Second.
So the,
And how did that all?
So, according to Donald Nichols, who was the man that gave all of these oral histories to Danby and was her lover, after the first child died, just living a month and a half, Silas said, okay, you know, children die all the time, we've got to get on with life and make another baby. And she said, I just can't do it right now. You know, I'm not ready, I'm still grieving. And he kept after and kept after. She said, look, if you want to go sow your wild oats, go sow your wild oats, but I can't do it. And he quietly went about sowing his wild oats, and one day when this particular woman, who nobody knows who it was, which, I mean, in a small town like Danby in the 1800s, come on, people knew. But the town clerk in the vital records, where they list the father's name and the mother's name, wrote S.L. Griffith for the father, and for the mother, he filled in that spot K-N-O-W, no name. And on Jenny's death certificate, it says mother unknown. Now there was some other record that Annie uncovered that said the mother's name was Lydia, but no last name.
And his wife was willing to raise the child?
And she raised the child. And when she divorced Silas, she took Jenny and moved to Brandon. And Jenny's husband was part of Silas's business empire. He worked in the office. And then Libby, Elizabeth, his first wife, had the other two children, Agatha and Harry. And then it's very interesting about KT. She goes into it to some extent in the book. KT clearly did not want to marry Silas. It was strictly a marriage of convenience. And this woman, Emma Rising, who the Risings lived in Rupert, and Seth Rising was actually a political opponent of Silas for the Senate. Emma was constantly invited to the house, and after Silas died, Emma moved into the house. And time went by, and they didn't have anything like a civil union in those days, so KT, who was about 20 years older than Emma, adopted her. So Emma Rising was KT's adopted daughter, and then when KT died in 1938, she got all the money. The world doesn't change that much, does it? It's just the characters that play different roles.
Thank you for shedding light on Danby.
Absolutely.
the cellar holes in East Dorset and Mount Tabor?
Herb Ogden, who's an officer in our society, is doing work, and also Netnell Crisp, who is one of our younger members. He's a student at Yale, and he's had a hobby for many years of metal detecting. So now that they have LiDAR, they've taken those images, and Netnell goes around metal detecting at the cellar holes, and Herb is trying to figure out property lines and put all of that together, and also where some of the old roads were in Mount Tabor, because all of that has disappeared over the last, it's now 100 years basically that the Forest Service has owned it.
And do we know what the cause of death, the causes was of all these infants and young children that you referenced?
We know that Harry, that was documented. One of the neighbors, William Pierce, kept diaries, which unfortunately washed down the stream in Irene. But he recorded, like, for the 3 or 4 months that Harry was ill, how Harry was doing, and it basically came down to that he had incurable diarrhea. But so many infants died back in the 1800s. That was not an uncommon event. I mean, you go to any of these cemeteries and see the stones with infants, and very often they have a little lamb. And of course, mothers died in childbirth too. So feel free to take a close look at it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.